Hi everyone, Stjepan here. In today's video I'm going to cover the exchange variation of the Philidor defense, which is probably the most popular variation on all levels lower than, I would say, FIDE master, and it is the most natural move, and it's the almost automatic reply in most games, at least I've seen, and probably it's the simplest way to play for black. So we are looking at the position after e4, e5, knight f3, d6, the Philidor defense. If you haven't seen the introductory video, I have linked it in the description below. You can check it out to make sure you understand the basic ideas of the opening. And today we are focusing on the main move d4 for white. And here black can either choose to capture on d4 or to simply develop a piece defending the e5 pawn. So now, for the moment, black is under pressure. The knight and the d4 pawn are attacking e5. So you can either defend or exchange. Defending with c6 isn't popular because of the move d5, of course, grabbing space. And as opposed to some other variations, such as the Nimzovich defense, where black does allow white to cramp his position down, here it's actually not favorable because your knight could end up on g6 and, well, it could be useful, but it's not a popular move, and black is best to develop his knight either to f6 or to d7. Those are the two variations that we are going to cover in the following videos. Knight f6, the Nimzovich variation, and knight d7, the Hanem variation. Today we are focusing on e takes d4. E takes d4 resolves the central tension and sort of gives up the nature of the position. So now you have the pawn structure with the white pawn on e4, and you have the black pawn structure with the pawn on c6. One thing that should be said about this is that the e4 pawn is restricting the f6 knight from entering the d5 square, and the c6 pawn is very good from preventing the white knights from entering e5 and c5. So both pawns are useful. I would argue that the black position is more solid, but white, of course, has more space and controls more important squares in the center. Still, it's hard that black is ever going to be in trouble and give white targets because his structure is perfectly solid. And if white wants to solidify his structure, he's going to have to play the move f3. Now, one thing that should be said about this position is that even though it's considered to be the most boring way to play the Philidor, the resulting positions are in fact very interesting, and most often the players are going to castle queenside. The white player is going to castle queenside, and it's going to be opposite side castling. So the positions arising from the exchange Philidor are very exciting. Okay, first let's look at all of the options. One option which I do want to mention is bishop c4, which isn't a popular move. It has only been played 10 or 20 times on the highest levels. It's a gambit similar to the Scotch gambit, similar to what white does in the fantasy variation of the Caro-Kann, where you are aiming at the f7 weakness, and of course if black isn't careful and he simply, let's say, to bishop c4, black simply develops the knight to f6, then you have tricks with bishop takes f7, king takes f7, knight g5 check, and you win your piece back. So yeah, you could say that this move is interesting for blitz chess, but generally it's not a popular move. Yeah, I wanted to say when the bishop is on g4, then you can win the bishop. But still an interesting option if you want to surprise black. The engines are going to give it as better for white still, but practically speaking, black is going to have an easier time equalizing this position. Moves such as c5 could be played, but I think that then you are justifying the pawn sacrifice for white, and white can have an easier game. The main moves, of course, are recapturing the pawn either with the knight or with the queen. Recapturing with the knight is much more popular. It has been played almost 3,000 times. Recapturing with the queen has only been played around 500 times. One of the most obvious reasons is that knight c6 is a tempo gaining move, and the fact remains that even though the queen doesn't recapture in many positions, black is going to play knight c6 anyway. So it's a fairly useful move. Now, what black wants to achieve is either a paired type position, which we are going to see with g6, bishop g7, c6, where black plays a sort of strange pairs because he doesn't have the e5 break in the center. And the other type of position is simple kingside castling, knight f6, bishop e7. So one thing that is good about the Exchange Philidor for black is that it's fairly simple to play. And you are going to have two possible setups. You can opt for one or the other. And yeah, you want to attack on the queen side as soon as possible. Okay, let's go over queen takes first. So d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4. Here black has three possibilities. One of them is pretty hard to understand. That's the move a6. But if you know Peertz type positions, then a6 is a fairly common move, which restricts the c6 knight from entering b5. It also restricts the bishop from entering b5, and this diagonal could be very tender for black, so a6 is understandable. The other two moves are knight c6 and knight f6. Knight f6 is considered to be the main line, so let's go over a6 first. And this might be a sideline which could confuse your opponents because it seems to waste time. Of course, white is up in development. He has two pieces already developed. And after his next move, when he develops the dark squared bishop, white is going to be full to two pieces up in development. So the two moves here are either bishop g5 or bishop f4. I prefer the move bishop g5 because bishop f4 is sort of staring at this wall of pawns. So bishop f4, knight c6, the queen has to move to d2, knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, normal development, castles, castles. This is the starting position, and you can see that this f4 bishop, even though it is exerting some pressure on d6 and on the central squares, and of course helping with the idea of e5, it's not really that useful. And I think that even though e5 is a common idea, in some of these positions, I think that you should aim for a quick attack with g4, g5, rather than trying to break in the center. And most often this bishop isn't going to be that useful, in my opinion. The other possibility after a6 is bishop g5, which allows black to develop. Black can either play knight f6 here, where he will be in some trouble, so knight c6, a counterattack, is a more common move. After knight c6, the queen goes to d2, and now bishop e7. After bishop e7, as white, you don't really want to develop this bishop. If black captures, then your knight is going to come to g5. Knight c3 for white, a simple developing move, and now bishop takes g5 should be played, knight takes g5. And I think that this knight is okay here, at least provoking the move h6, and after knight f3, knight f6 castles. I think that this is a very improved version of what we just saw with bishop f4. When you look at this position with bishop f4, you have these two bishops here, and I think that the e7 bishop is a much better defender than what the f4 bishop is doing in the attack. So if you look at this position here, I think this is an improvement for white. Not that the engines would give it as a big of a difference, but I still think bishop g5 is more precise. And this position is fairly simple to grasp. As black, you want to play g5, g4, h5, h4, try to create an attack, and you are sure to face an attack with g4, f4, h4, and black trying to cramp you down. One key square in the position is the e5 square, and if you manage to castle, play knight e5, takes, and if this square is sufficiently defended, let's say you develop your bishop first, then I think as you relieve the pressure of the position, make the pawn structure symmetrical, it's going to be fairly easy to play. Of course, then you can't really go for a win. It's going to be really hard. So that's the move. That's the move a6 here after queen takes d4. And since queen takes d4 could be considered a surprise, then a6 could be a counter surprise which you could use. And I still think the positions are fairly simple to play. The next sideline is the most obvious move, knight c6. I wouldn't recommend this move because the position sort of gets cramped for black, and white is pinning him on all sides of the board, and black doesn't have that much space. The most natural move here, of course, isn't dislodging your free queen from the center, but bishop b5, simply pinning the knight. Bishop d7, and now your best idea is to take, so you capture bishop c6. Bishop c6, knight c3, normal development, knight f6, bishop g5, pinning on the other side of the board, bishop e7 and pinning again, and now castles, castles. Here you have the same situation as before, well, fairly similar, but you didn't waste a move playing a6. So the difference is, if you look at this position with bishop g5, the light squared bishop is still here, and well, basically, I'm sorry, the knight is still here, and you could argue which one of these pieces is better. I think that for black, the position that we just saw could be a slight improvement because this bishop is actually a great defender of the diagonal. But when you look at this position here, I think that The c6 bishop in these variations is aiming at the wrong side of the board, so it's going to be hard to use him in the attack. So if you think about this, the difference between knight c6 and a6, there are pros and cons. Perhaps this one is safer for black to play, but I wouldn't give black as many chances. And I think that white's position is perfectly playable, and I would argue better. So the most natural plans for white are simply h4, h5, trying to open up the h-file, rerouting the knight somewhere in the center. I like the maneuver knight h4, knight f5. If you manage to get your knight to f5, it's going to be pretty scary. You can also simply opt for rook h2, e1, and let's say rook e8, king b1. The position goes on from here. White has more central control. White has more squares and more space for his pieces, and generally white should be better. And this is why the move knight c6 isn't really that popular. After queen takes d4, the most popular move is knight f6. And this move does seem to be the most sensible way to play. You want to castle. It's that simple. You are developing your piece. You are not afraid of e5 because you can simply capture that. And if a queen exchange happens, then it's going to be fine. I'm just seeing this variation of 3-5. No games have been found. Yeah. No games have been found because this is apparently more than enough for black to equalize. Yeah, it's a harmless position. So you are not really afraid of e5. After knight f6, white copies black, sort of, wants to castle as soon as possible, so knight c3. Bishop e7, bishop g5, castles. It's fairly similar to the other positions that we've just seen. The difference here is, though, that black didn't play a6, black didn't play knight c6, allowing the bishop b5 pin, so this objectively is the best way to play. After castles, knight c6 developing now, queen to d2, there's no point in playing bishop b5 now, the queen was en prise. The position continues bishop e6, bishop b5 now when the queen isn't under pressure. Whether white wants to capture or not, I think is arguable. Opening up the b file should certainly favor black. Bishop b5 is played anyway. Knight b4, and now we get this forcing line, which should be much better for black, and this is something I would like to highlight here. This forcing variation has been played around 10 times. And black wins 80% of the games. If you look at this position here, it's equal or slightly better for white with the move king b1. And white basically has to be very careful for the moment the a2 pawn was attacked. But there's a nice variation which I would like to mention. So after the move bishop b5, which probably isn't going to be played in every game because it doesn't make that much sense visually, you can play knight b4, and then if a3 happens, which should be a fairly common move, white thinking that the knight is trapped, or the bishop rather, you don't have to play the move knight a2 check, knight a2, bishop a2, and then b3, where your bishop is trapped. You can interpose a6. And now once white plays bishop a4, you do have the trick of knight a4 check, knight a2 check, I'm sorry. So the position goes knight a2 check, knight takes a2, knight takes e4, attacking the queen. And this is the intermezzo move that black is counting on. So if you look at this position once again, so firstly, you chase the bishop away. If white takes and black takes, then the a-file opens. Black is much better. But after bishop a4, you don't play b5, you play knight a2 check. And after knight takes a2, you take on e4. Of course, white can take on e7, but after bishop e7, queen e7, the queen is still under pressure. And after queen e3, you can now play bishop takes a2. And the point is that after bishop takes a2, if white tries to play the move b3, then after b3, b5 is simply winning. You can see when I turn on the engine, the bishop is of course trapped, and you don't really trade the pieces. You open up the position in a very favorable manner for black. So let's look at this position once again. So e4, e5, knight f3, d6, the Philidor, d4, e4 exchange, and we are looking at queen takes d4 and knight f6, the main move. Your aim as black is to castle kingside, your aim as white is to castle queenside. And if we follow this variation through, there's a very fun variation after bishop b5, which I think you should know, because even though bishop b5 doesn't really do much and it doesn't really threaten to take on c6, I think that still, where do you develop your bishop? D3 doesn't make much sense, E2 doesn't make much sense, G3, G2 doesn't make much sense because the bishop would be useless on this diagonal, so you might face bishop b5. And remember, knight b4, a3, a6, bishop a4, and now knight a2 check, knight takes a2, knight takes e4, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, bishop e3, queen e3, and now bishop takes a2. White normally continues with knight to d2, and the position goes on from here, and black is better, which is very rare for a Philidor position on move 15. So in this variation, black is superior. So if white takes with the queen, play knight f6, and remember that you castle on opposite sides. So we get fairly interesting positions, and I have to say I never really considered the Exchange Philidor to be an exciting opening, but as you can see, it can be very exciting. Okay, let's go on to the main move. Knight takes d4. After knight takes d4, there are two options for black. I would like to mention the Larsen variation first. The main move is knight f6 by far, and the Larsen variation is the second option. This is a variation that used to be popular in the 60s, of course, when Bent Larsen played it. Now it isn't played as often, and you sort of get a weird Pirtz position with white castling queenside, and I'm not really sure what to think about it. So the position continues knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, queen d2. You can see what both sides are doing, castles, castles. And you have the Pirtz position without the e-pawn and with white castling queenside very rapidly. Of course, in any Pirtz, if you can achieve this, then you are very happy. If you turn on the engine, this is almost +1 for white. The reason is simple, that white is going to have a quicker attack and black doesn't really have that much yet. Rook to e8 is the main move. f3. Once again, a simple move. You can also go for bishop h6 before that, but f3 is the best way to play. Knight c6, g4, and already you can see that black is in trouble, and I can't really justify the variation. You get, in my opinion, a bad version of the Pirtz for black, and white is much quicker, or a weird dragon with the c pawn here instead of the e pawn. Put this pawn from c7 to e7, and you have a bad variation of the Sicilian dragon for black, where black is several tempi down. Knight e5, attacking the f3 pawn, of course. If that's captured, then yeah, it's going to be hard for white to play. So he has to put some further defense onto the pawn. Of course, black is threatening c5, removing the defender and taking on f3. So bishop e2, a6, stopping knight b5 or bishop b5 and starting an attack. g5 now, knight h5 is the best defense, rook h to g1, b5. And black is hoping to create an attack of his own, and with the move knight h5, he has sort of solidified his position. But I think that after a fairly simple move such as f4, and once the knight moves, capturing on h5, g takes h5, and g6, white is much quicker in the attack. And what's certain is that black can go wrong fairly easily. It's really hard to play this position. I've tried setting it up on the board, tried to find an attacking plan for black, and everything I did was too slow. In fact, from this position, there have been 2 games with knight b3, where white had won, and 1 game with knight d5 and 1 game with f4 where actually black had won. And this game with f4 continued with knight c4, opening up the b file, bishop takes c4, b takes c4, and f5 was played. I'm wondering whether he could have moved his queen in this position, whether he could have moved his queen back. Yeah, but the bishop is hanging. So yeah, you after f4, it's really hard to take on h5. So anyway, black ended up winning this position, but I still think it's easier for white to play. Okay, so that would be the move g6, which I really wouldn't recommend. Stick to the main line, knight f6. After knight f6, once again the same plans, knight c3 developing rapidly, bishop e7, and here the position branches out. This is where the exchange variation of the Philidor really starts and where the mainline theory begins, and this is what you are going to get in most of your positions. Here white can choose between 4 different moves: bishop e2, g3, bishop f4, and bishop c4. Fairly different options. Bishop e2 is the main line. simply trying to castle as soon as possible, playing a passive position. And with bishop e2, both sides castle kingside, and that is the boring Philidor that all of us know. G3 also both sides castle kingside. Your plan is to play bishop g2 and castle, while at the same time black is going to try to break up stuff in the center. Bishop f4 is once again, in my opinion, an inferior move because it's staring at this wall of pawns, but in some variations d5 is possible for black, which of course can't be played after bishop f4 because c7 is going to be too weak. And bishop c4 is probably the most aggressive move, looking at the f7 square and still preparing to castle kingside. So the one thing which should be mentioned is that if you play the main line with black, and if white plays the main line, so after e takes d4, knight takes d4, you go for knight f6, you can expect calmer games. So in order to spice things up, one side or the other are going to have to accept deviating from the mainline theory. Okay, let's look at them in some order. Bishop c4 first. Castles, f7 was under pressure already. Castles, c6, trying to push through d5. In some positions, a4, a5 stopping any further advance. Rook to e1, knight a6, looking at the b4 square. Bishop f4 developing the bishop, knight b4. And the engines love this position for white, even though bishop c4 wasn't the most precise move. The reason is simple. You have more space in the center. Your knights are amazing, the d4 knight and the c3 knight. Your rook is already developed on e1. You have some ideas of e5, in fact, which could come fairly quickly. And your only problem is the c2 square, which is defended for the moment. On the other hand, it's not really clear where this bishop is going, and if this bishop remains on c8, then where does the a8 rook go? So I would say that white has an easier time developing. And of course, there are ideas of perhaps retreating your bishop and playing f4, as in some other variations. There are ideas of simply putting pressure on f7. You can always put your knight on f4 if you think the moment is correct, and it's hard for black to fight against these positions. From here on, 3 games have actually been played. White won 2, 1 was a draw, so you can see that it's fairly hard to play, and those are grandmaster games. So bishop c4 should be superior for white. After bishop e7, the second move I want to mention is bishop f4, which can transpose if white plays bishop c4 later on, but is in fact much more aggressive. I like the move bishop f4 here because the idea isn't to put pressure on this diagonal. The idea is to castle queenside as soon as possible. Now you could argue whether bishop g5 or bishop f4 should be played. I'm still an advocate of bishop g5. But bishop f4 seems to be the preferred method among grandmasters. Black now castles, white plays queen d2. And the plan is simple, knight c6, castles queenside. Here black has the option of exchanging the knight d4, queen d4, bishop e6, and now f3. And white is once again going for the straightforward attacking method of g4, g5, which I really like. On the other hand, black is going to have to be really quick in the attack, and one of the best ways to do that is to reroute the knight to influence the center this way. So knight d7, queen e3, and now bishop f6. And now these bishops do look good for black. A maneuver or a pawn advance with h5, h4, h3 could weaken the structure significantly, and if you manage to create one hole in white's position, then white could be in trouble. g4 is the main move here, a6, and after a6 the plan is of course b5, and it's also stopping knight b5, bishop b5, g5, bishop e5, and now h4. Scary for black, but if you do know what you're doing, then you could be okay. This is one of the rare positions in which the engines actually think it's equal, but you need to be more precise than white does. Okay, after bishop e7, the third sideline I want to talk about is the move g3, which is sort of a King's Indian attack, or a Sicilian with g3 for white. A Sicilian type position with a knight on d4 and knight on c3. And in general, these positions for white do resemble the Sicilian structure. Now, whether it's a positive or a negative thing that the pawn is on c7 instead of e7 could be argued. Here black has two approaches to the position. The simpler one is castles, bishop g2, rook e8, castles, bishop f8, and trying to play a sensible position which is slow, h3, c6, a4. And the second approach, which I would definitely recommend if you want to fight for a win, which you probably do, after g3 is to play the move d5. d5 tries to resolve the central tension. If white ever takes, then the structure is symmetrical and the position is fine for black. The critical move is e5, chasing the knight farther away, and the move is knight g4. After knight g4, white continues with bishop g2, castles. You can see that both pawns are hanging, of course, and neither side is going to try to defend, but an exchange is going to happen with knight takes e5, knight takes d5, and bishop c5. After bishop c5, the thing about this position is that the structure is completely symmetrical. One thing I would like to mention is that white's bishop pair seems to be superior, especially the light squared bishop, when it's not really that clear what the bishop is going to be doing on g4 when the queen simply moves. While on the other hand, the g2 bishop is probably the best minor piece on the board. So I think that g3 after d5 gives black an equal position, and it's the most active way to play, but still white should hold a slight edge. Okay, now let's go back to the main line. Let's just repeat the position. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, e takes d4, the exchange variation, knight takes d4, the main move. We're looking at knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, and now the main move for white, bishop e2. Bishop e2 is sort of similar to what to the classical variation of the Najdorf, when after a6 white continues with bishop e2 and castles short. Once again, the difference is that the pawn is on e7 instead of c7, and a6 has been played. So ideas for white are similar to what he does in the Najdorf, but you are fighting on the semi-open e file instead of the semi-open c file. After bishop e2, both sides castle, and you see that you have a slow game in front of you, except for one option white has. After rook e8, if white wants an active position, and this is in fact what I have played in my only game against the Najdorf in the Zadar Open 2018, I played this position with f4. This is the only chance for white to gain an edge. Now, the thing is that f4 is a double-edged move, and you have, of course, weakened the e4 square, and you're never going to be able to defend it. So basically, your options are e5 or f5 in the future. And black has the dangerous d5 break. So you can imagine that in most positions, you are going to be faced with e takes, with d5 and d takes d5, and you're going to have this lonely f4 pawn, which blocks out your bishop and isn't really that useful. So it's not that big of a deal for black, but it's still the only aggressive way for white to play. Now black has to react. Bishop f8, stopping e5, bishop f3, c5, chasing the knight away, and if black doesn't play active chess, then he is going to lose, because white does have more space. c5, knight b3, and now you play knight c6, looking at the d4 square. If you manage to get rid of this knight, let's say you play a5, a4, and put your knight on d4, then black is going to be fine. White continues with rook e1, trying to renew the threat of e5 in many positions, a5. White has to play a4, and now you play knight b4. So either way, black is going to have an active square for his knight and a target on c2 in most positions. Now bishop e3 is played, developing the bishop, and d5. Black should remember this thematic break. It's often a pawn sacrifice to be able to activate your bishop, but in compensation you are going to tie down the black pieces to the c2 square, and it's not really easy to let go of the pawn, because then you have to move your knight and stuff like that. So when d5 is played, white of course cannot allow d4, he takes it. And it is a temporary pawn sacrifice. In some positions the pawn will be recaptured, and most often it is going to be recaptured. For now, of course, it's defended 3 times. Bishop f5 is played instead. Now, is your backward d6 pawn worth anything if it blocks your position and doesn't allow your bishop to develop comfortably. If you look at this position, where does the bishop go if black doesn't play d5? So I think that this pawn sacrifice is necessary. d5, ed5, and now bishop f5. White now has to continue with rook c1, defending c2, and now we play rook c8. So I think that even though black has given up a pawn, now his pieces have actually come alive, and I can't find a single bad piece in the black position. Well, on the other hand, the b3 knight doesn't seem that great. It is putting pressure on c5, but b6 can be played, and I think this position is perfectly playable. If you ask the engines, they of course prefer white, +1, because white is a pawn up and he still has ideas of g4. But one thing has to be said, that white is going to have to play carefully and aggressively at the same time in order to utilize his advantages. From a practical perspective, it's really hard to do that. Okay, so this would be the main move and the main line of the exchange Philidor. So after e takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, bishop e2. After bishop e2, for black, remember that at some point you want to push through with d5. Before that you want to play c5 and knight c6. And for white, remember that you want to castle as soon as possible and play the move f4. If black isn't careful, and if he doesn't play moves such as bishop f8 to defend the e5 break, if you manage to play e5 with white, you are going to be better. Okay, so this was the exchange Philidor. Let me know what you think. I think this is still the most interesting variation of the Philidor defense for black. Not that he has an advantage in almost any line except in the one line that we saw with knight a2 check, but it's playable, and white, if he is a better player, higher rated than you, is going to get frustrated because it's hard to create an initiative. And most often white isn't going to know the theory. So if you study the Philidor and use it as your sideline weapon, then know your theory and you can often gain advantages from the opening. Thank you very much. Let me know what you think. Yeah, thank you once again for the support. It really means a lot, and thank you for the kind comments. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. See you later.